So, hi, yes, welcome, Alexandra. As Natalia said, I am a PhD candidate at Northwestern. Principally, my research is in theater history, but I'm also coming from a practical theater background. I studied performance in undergrad, and I studied dramaturgy and criticism at the master's level at Brooklyn College. I'm coming from a range of practices in theater, and I'm ultimately now training to be an academic. I'm pretty far along, actually, so I have one more year before I get my PhD, and then my goal is to be a professor of theater, but then also to continue some practical form of theater practice in some way. On the agenda, actually, I've made space for hearing what participants are interested in terms of theater, because of course, and maybe you've thought of this, this is a very large field and kind of a broad topic. So particularly since there's so few of us and we can do this more directly than sort of an anonymous webinar, I'd be curious if you would share, perhaps if you can turn your microphone and just tell us a bit, or tell me personally a bit about what your interest is before we go into this, and then I can kind of make some notes as we're going along. I have, an outline of the agenda, but I can include some more specific things. Great.
Okay, Alexandra, you should be able to use your microphone now. Your browser might prompt you for like this little window can pop up to accept the usage of microphone, and then you should be able to speak and we should be able to hear you.
Okay, I think I turned it on. I'm not sure.
Yes, okay, we can hear you. Perfect.
Okay, that's great, because I didn't know how to do that, but now it's all right.
Great. Nice to hear from you. So if you want to just briefly say a little bit about yourself so that I can know moving forward if there's anything I can direct towards your personal interests.
Yeah, sure. So I just, this whole webinar just popped on my page, and I've been interested in theater studies for a while. I attend like theater in Warsaw in Poland, but I also study applied linguistics, so like studying abroad have always been like in my mind as an option. So I thought, why not, I would want to learn something about it, and I'm especially interested in like musical theater.
Okay, great. Well, musical theater is particularly American, so something we can offer. Okay, great. So that's good for me to know. And I'll just move forward. But since it's just us, also please feel free to ask specific questions as we go along. I've left some time in the end as well for other questions or comments. But we'll move forward. So
okay, sure.
Great. You thankfully are already somebody who's a bit already on board with this idea of studying theater, but I figured there's also some good practical rationale, especially if not everyone's families are so supportive also of studying the arts. I know this comes up sometimes with different types of families, but also individuals who are sort of on the fence. There are some great reasons to study theater, and this is not a comprehensive list, but first and foremost, studying performance, in particular at the undergraduate level or any of these levels, really allows you to focus obviously on your performance skills. So I'll talk in a minute about what the US has to offer in terms of the vast range, but in terms of really honing in on, like you've mentioned, possibly musical theater, singing while performing, while dancing, is a very specific set of skills. And this is your opportunity to spend, you know, a long time, 4 years, really working on that from a number of different angles. So I'll also talk a little bit about the differences between conservatory and university programs. But in any of these bachelor's or bachelor's of fine arts or bachelor's of arts programs, you're essentially spending these 4 years gaining college credit working on performance skills. So it's a pretty compelling rationale if that's where your interest lies. But beyond that, there are also very marketable professionalization skills that you're gaining that can help you in a number of other fields, including things like linguistics. Because theater and performance ultimately is about interpersonal relations and communication, right? So this has also become kind of a hot topic for undergrads looking at theater, then looking to move into other fields afterwards. It's something that a lot of businesses are looking for in terms of their employees, but this kind of ability to be comfortable in an improvisational or presentational setting. I can't vouch enough for theater sort of being the way that people can become their most comfortable selves in terms of presentation and self-presentation. I have found it tremendously helpful personally, both as you know, someone who meets with students, but also in the classroom and in a variety of other settings. So even if you end up leaving theater, I mean to say, you will leave with some very important skills moving forward in your adult life. And then one of my favorite elements, as someone who's written theater reviews and has worked as a dramaturg and I'm a historian, the critical reading skills and analysis skills that you gain through the process of theater education at the undergraduate level or moving forward are tremendous. And in some ways, you know, you might be able to find sort of comparable access to analysis in like literary studies or comp lit, something like this. But working with the text the way that you do in theater, where you're analyzing the context and the character and the narrative and the setting, and you're embodying it through performance, is a very different approach to critical analysis and sort of being able to wear the text in my mind and in my experience offers up an entire different sort of means of understanding how to analyze text. And as I've listed here, you know, there's even practical ways that that gets enacted in terms of theater and performance and dramaturgy, which is itself its own profession, is one of those key ways as well. Critical analysis, theater reviews, and things like that are another really important avenue in this regard. So that's a little soapbox on why to study in general, but then in the US, why specifically? And one of the biggest reasons I have to say is just the vast offering that the US has. There's such an enormous number of programs. And within that range of programs, there are very, very different types that you can access that is just sort of incomparable given its sheer size and the number of programs in each different state and the different types of programs in each state as well. So I've just made a little bit of a list here of the different kind of categories of study, and they all mean something sort of different. And some programs offer a real range, and some of them focus on something more specific, which is also to say, as I note here, what's most important as you're looking into moving forward and applying to programs, it's kind of vital to do some research, to kind of study the offerings of each of these programs to really understand what exactly you're looking for and your priorities are because of the range that you can find. So there's theater and drama. So that's essentially performance and text analysis. Whenever you hear drama as one of the titles in a program or the disciplinary approach, it's really talking about the text. Theater and performance studies, or just performance studies, and that essentially means theater in a normative sense, so in a theater in a box, or theater in the round or whatever, but in terms of it being within something called a theater. And then performance studies is about everyday performances or performance art or things like this. So essentially performance outside of the box of theater. And there's a lot of overlap, but there are also some very key differences. If you have any questions about that, we can talk about that as well. A lot of programs in theater also specifically focus on dance. There's a lot of overlap in terms of movement studies, but there are also, of course, just standalone dance programs. Musical theater is something that the US really specializes in, and really what we can take credit for in terms of sort of the American contribution to theater history in general. And it just goes on from there. Of course, there's playwriting, there's directing, there are dramaturgy-focused programs, there's design programs, but I just put a couple of the core performance-related disciplines up there. Then, within that offering, there's also the broader context of all of these different programs across the US, and they also boast their own community theater setting. So because of this diversity of locations and range of school sizes and locations, you have a lot of programs that are in urban areas, but you also have a lot of programs that are in more suburban areas, and that will impact what sort of broader theater opportunities are available. In some places, and this might be a boon to the program, it often is, in some places the university is really the only theater that's being offered to that community, and therefore there's sort of a community theater feel to the university setting. And you have audiences that are coming from off campus instead of just on campus, so it's a bit different. But then you have also larger communities that have college programs as well as their own community theaters, and depending on the size of places or just community theaters in general, there's usually an encouragement for students in theater to be participating, at least auditioning for those community theaters, and then it sort of grows from there. If you're in a bigger city, you might have a regional theater, and that works within its own system, and you can audition for that as well. And then if you're in an even bigger city, say like New York City, you have things like off-Broadway theaters, off-Broadway theaters, and all the way up to Broadway. And then I put leagues on there too, because the entire American theater system is so vast and disconnected. There's a lot of different names for the types of theater communities there are. So Chicago is one of these places that has an enormous number of theaters and an enormous number of sizes of theaters, but it's all connected through something called the League of Chicago Theaters. But at all of these levels, if you are a student studying at an American university or college in a theater program, there's access to these different theaters in different ways, at least at the auditioning level. And they give you access to, if you're going to stay in the US potentially, to understanding the different ways that they function. Because of course, we don't have a nationalized system of funding, so the funding system works very differently and very differently at different levels. Lorch theaters, for example, which are the regional theater network across the US, they have a very specific sort of union system and payment system and things like that, which is even different than Broadway and off-Broadway and all of that. So it's a way to kind of learn from experience, and you get different examples of that at the different schools that there might be that you're interested in. And then finally, one more compelling reason to study in the US in theater is that we have a really, given the number of schools, given the number of programs, we have an incredibly exciting and wonderful range of practicing artists and scholars who teach at these different programs. So not to dwell on this too long, because of course, you have specific interests. I have to admit, I'm not in musical theater, so we have different interests in that regard. But just a very basic example, I went to UC Santa Cruz as an undergrad, as Natalia mentioned, and I studied with one of the foremost worldwide scholars in Southeast Asian puppetry and dance. that just happened because she was there and that's where she teaches. And so I gained access to that as a result, and then found, you know, the incredible inspiration of a very niche but very impressive type of art form that maybe I never would have come across otherwise. So a few examples of sort of why it's even worth looking at the US. So from there, I just want to break down very basically the types of programs at the bachelor level. And again, this is something, please ask questions, and we can come back to this later. But there's two essentially basic formats. When I say basic, I mean essentially everything fits within one or the other. But some programs are a bit squishy, or you can find sort of access to both types in one university setting. So it's not quite as cut and dry, but just to give you an overall sense, there's a BFA, which would be a conservatory program, or there's a BA, which would be more nested within a university program. And I've just put down a really basic breakdown of how these are distinguished. So in a conservatory program, you're auditioning for the program itself. And of course, you also have to audition for productions. So typically, even if you're in a program, you're going to have to audition for the productions that are going on in that program, which is essentially all part of professionalization. Smaller cohorts, that's because you audition to get in the first place. And then there's often, but not always, a restriction on your first year. So typically in a conservatory program, and even in some university programs, so it's something worth asking about if this is a question for you. Usually you cannot perform in your first year in a conservatory program. There's sort of an idea that you would be gaining the skills or the, what's the word, sort of the hallmark of the program before you're then performing in it. And then in a conservatory, of course, you're more focused on a very specific area. So this is where you might, really hone your skills as an actor or a director or a playwright, and you're really just focusing on those skills. So your classes are geared towards that and not necessarily a broader picture of theater or even of the humanities, which is converse to the university bachelor's program. So you often, but not always, are just applying to the university in the BA program, and sometimes you have to audition for the program, but it's much less typical. So typically, if you get into the university for the theater program, you're just in the theater program and you don't audition, but you do audition for productions. Because of this, you're going to find larger cohorts, but a typical example of the university theater department is that they're offering many more different types of performance practices or technical and design practices that everyone has to take. So while you have a larger cohort in general, not everyone is interested in the exact same thing. So it still kind of breaks down that you're working with a smaller group of people. Only some people will be actors and only some people will be dancers, but you get a bit more mixing in larger classes like history classes or design classes and things like that. I will say, for the record, this was my undergrad experience. I did a BA and I absolutely loved it. And I had access to learning about design and learning about tech and things that ultimately I didn't end up doing professionally, but that felt very necessary to me to understanding the larger picture of the world of production, if that makes sense. So for me, it's a bit of what I like to preach because it's been such a meaningful experience in my educational upbringing and professional experience. But I know different people come from different backgrounds and have different specializations. So feel free to ask more about that if you're curious. But that's sort of that's the hat that I put in. That's the ring I put my hat into. So Much like the conservatory program, there's sometimes restrictions on your first year, or you have to have certain fulfillments before you can be in a larger production, something like that. That's how the Santa Cruz program was. And then what's interesting about the university program or the BA program is that you can minor in theater. So some people are there just to do, you know, gosh, 8 credits or 12 credits or something like that, which counts as a minor rather than a major. And that's an interesting thing if you're coming to the university system with multiple goals, which a lot of students are. That's an interesting way to continue to explore theater without necessarily putting all the eggs in that basket. So I wanted to include that as well. So then where do you go from a BA or a BFA? The good news is you can go a lot of directions. And really making the choice between a BA or BFA isn't necessarily going to lock you into any one path in any direction. It still gives you many opportunities to kind of pursue the artistic development path or scholarly research development path, or go straight into professional work in any of these cases. So this is a little bit of a convoluted chart, but I'll talk you through it. And then I've also included some kind of fun design sketches and some scenic elements, just because this is the world sort of we're living in and putting stock into. So from your BA and your BFA, some people go directly into professional work. This is, I would say, a bit more typical of performers, so actors and dancers, dancers, musical theater. If you are in a situation in which you just are hitting the ground in the performance, the audition circuit. So it's not for everyone, and it is it can be a slog, but it's sort of a situation where you get an agent and you go to auditions and you join a union, most likely if you're staying in the US. Alternatively, though, a lot of people, including myself, pursue master's level work. And I did this while I was working at a theater in New York. I pursued a master's and an MA, not an MFA. But I'll talk through a bit the difference there. So an MFA in theater is more typical of sort of the next level of professionalization. So even if you have a BFA, it's not uncommon for people to do an MFA. And the main selling point of that is that it's more or less directly practical work in the industry that you want to be in. So for an MFA, I would suggest really looking into the city that you're hoping to have a professional career and finding an MFA there. Because the point is to really open the door to you to the professional community in that specific field. So whether it's acting, directing, design of all the range of design in theater, dramaturgy, what you're looking for in an MFA is that to be the direct stepping stone into the professional practice. So that's why I have this here. So from the MFA, you can go directly into teaching at the adjunct level, or depending on some schools in a conservatory program, because an MFA is a terminal degree, you can teach sort of as not quite a professor, but as a professional in the field. Another term for that is teaching artist. That's usually what they call professional artists with an MFA who are not teaching at the university level, but there's a lot of that kind of work, or you're working professionally from the MFA. And then the other route, which is the one that I've taken, is to go into an MA. So I worked in dramaturgy and theater criticism, and in management and producing in New York in theater. And I knew that I wanted to continue to pursue dramaturgy and history. And so I looked into master's level work that would support that. And so that's how I ended up at Brooklyn College, which is part of the City University of New York system. And an MA is not a terminal degree. So I always knew that if I wanted to continue to pursue more education, in other words, if I wanted to teach at the academic level, at the university level, I would have to get a PhD, which is ultimately what I decided on. But from either of these levels, of course, you can just transition into professional work at any time. So there are a number of people I knew who were working with me at the master's level in New York who became dramaturgs professionally and continued to work as dramaturgs and playwriting assistants and things like that in New York City. And then this path, as I mentioned, if you're going sort of the academic path, getting to academic research and a university teaching position also doesn't mean that you have to negate professional theater work. So as I mentioned earlier, that's my goal, is to get an academic position in the US and then also have that supported professional work, professional practice ongoing. So I see there's a question about schools to recommend. The thing is, there are so many, and they are tailored to such different needs and interests. I've included a small, not comprehensive list here of programs to consider that you might not necessarily have heard of before or have considered, because of course there are sort of the top programs and most known programs that are more specifically conservatory oriented. And I like to encourage people to look at both university and conservatory programs, and some programs like the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, or UNC, is a great program that is at an incredibly well-known scholarly research institute, UNC, but is a conservatory program. So you kind of get the benefit of a conservatory program while also still being in a rigorous academic community. So there's a lot of different types of values you could be looking for, and I just put this list up here to kind of give you some other ideas. UC Santa Cruz, again, is where I went for my undergrad. This is also a very large and reputable state university, and it offers a lot of very interesting and diverse and unusual disciplines, like they invented something called the history of consciousness, that could be of interest to you sort of above and beyond studying performance. And because it's a university program and not a conservatory program, you have a lot of general ed requirements, so you kind of get to sample from these other interesting departments across the university. Cal Arts is a really interesting and alternative conservatory program. They have a lot of very unusual offerings in terms of majors, but I'm almost certain they only offer BFAs. But it's a very different type of program, and it's a really interesting program, so it might be something worth looking into if you're sort of unsure which performance type or whether you might want to do interdisciplinary studies, something like that, but in a conservatory setting. As I mentioned, UNC has a really interesting conservatory program within a very excellent university setting. And I've actually never been there, but I have a lot of friends who've been, who study in North Carolina and Chapel Hill, and they just love it. So another good thing. Northwestern, which is where I'm currently a PhD student, has an excellent and really well-known theater program. And what I would say that not everyone knows when they're thinking about Northwestern is that Chicago, which is the city that Northwestern is located in, has just an unbelievable range of really interesting theater. And as you know, the so-called second city, Chicago, in comparison to New York, it's much more affordable. And so the theater that's getting made in Chicago is much more experimental. They have something called storefront theater, which is, you know, these tiny and interesting spaces that can be performed in and very cheaply. So there's not as much of a focus on sort of the commercial elements or ticket sales. The SUNY schools are really wonderful, the State University of New York system, and SUNY Purchase is very well known. That is a conservatory program, but it's at a state university, obviously. It's also something to consider is the cost differences between a private conservatory program and a state conservatory program. So I wanted to include that up there as sort of possibly one of the more affordable options. UT Austin is similarly, it's a public university that has a really well-known theater program that I believe offers BA and BFA. and they go all the way up to PhD level. And the same with University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And Ann Arbor is a very cute little place, and this is a kind of an example of a city in which you would probably, the theater on campus would be one of sort of the community stars, you know, as I was mentioning earlier, the different dynamics of different settings for these universities and the theaters within them. And then I just wanted to give some online resources before we turn into questions and comments. The Onstage blog is a good resource for looking up, updated per year, the different theater programs per state. So if you know there's a state you would like to be in, or even it's a good way to sort of get an updated view of how things are looking per year. Right now it's the 2019 list. And then a number of these are just resources in general for people who are interested in American theater, but sometimes there's also coverage on international theater. Of course, in Poland, there's so much amazing theater, and there is a good amount of material that you can find online here, so I figured I'll focus on the American material for now. But backstage.com, that's also a place where you can find job listings. It gives you a sense of kind of what's running, what's interesting. Playbill.com as well, that's really focused on New York. AmericanTheater.org, that is a nonprofit organization that has a lot of resources for teaching and people sort of interested in theater in a broader national sense in America. And then the next two, American Society for Theater Research and Association for Theater and Higher Education, those are the two main academic conferences that happen annually in the US. I'm a member of American Society for Theater Research. And so those are things to consider if sort of later down the line you're still interested in pursuing theater practically, but also perhaps research-wise or historically. There are really wonderful support networks for theater scholars. HowlRound is interesting. It was started by a couple of theater students. Oh, they might have been coming out of Yale, but I don't remember right in this moment. But they started a kind of an alternative critical theater website. And so they have a lot of theater reviews, but also sort of more open source commentary about the state of theater in general in the US. And then On Tap podcast is actually, full disclosure, one of the hosts is my dissertation advisor, Harvey Young. And it's a really excellent podcast that essentially is giving a look at the state of affairs during the context of that given podcast. I think they try and put out once a month. And they talk about the conferences, they talk about recent articles. So it's definitely more from a scholarly approach, but they're all practitioners as well. So there's just kind of a beautifully laid out discussion of the state of current affairs in theater in any given podcast. And on their website, they have a lot of back episodes as well. So that brings us to feedback. So if you have questions or comments or concerns, and let's see, are there some? Okay. And feel free, because it is still just us, and also welcome Małgorzata. If you want to turn your microphone on and you would rather ask it directly, that's also fine. Let's see. Where can I find more comprehensive list? So that Onstage blog is useful, but in general, even if you just kind of search very specific key terms on Google, like best US program for directing or for musical theater, things like that, there's a pretty fair generated list on there, but none of these things are going to be comprehensive, unfortunately. So I think I would start with by the discipline you're looking for, the type of performance, perhaps, and then if you have a sense of where in the country you might want to be based, or state school versus private school, or conservatory versus university system, things like that, that will be your way to kind of whittle things down. But I would start with kind of the bigger search if you can, you know, best US program in musical theater or something like that. Okay, we won't be able to hear you. That's okay. Are there other questions or thoughts or comments?
I'm wondering about the application process and how it looks generally, how early it starts, and some possible scholarships, how to apply for them.
Sure. Good question. It really depends. Typically, the application timeline is going to be very similar to more normative university programs. So applications starting in November, December, this kind of thing. And it will depend, though, what program you're looking at, if you're having to send in an audition tape or go to an audition, things like that. That will be the wild card in terms of an earlier timeline, if you're looking at conservatories. But in general, you're still going to have the same elements, letters of recommendation, personal statement, the online application. And I would recommend, when you get your list down where you're looking at applying to, that you reach out right away to the international office or the international resources for students. There will be something on the school website that is specifically for international students. And those people should be very kind to you and very interested to hear from you. And they will be the ones who will be able to tell you if there's additional opportunities, perhaps for applying for a fee waiver for the application, if there's work study, if there's grants, what exactly you're going to be eligible for. And there's really no bad time to contact them. Granted, I know now things are a bit up in the air in this particular moment, where they might not have all the answers in terms of next academic year yet. But the international office or international resources should be the people who have sort of the right answers and want to talk to you about them. And in a normal situation, this would not be too early to reach out to them.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Let's see. It really depends on the program in terms of there being scholarships. So again, you want to ask early, ask often about whether or not there are funding options. Depending on the schools, it really there's a range. So especially if it's a public school, they might have different types of funding options, like work study. If it's a private school, they might have more grants or fellowships. But it's something to really navigate at the individual school level. Any tips for preparing a portfolio and auditions? Yes. So typically there are online or recorded auditions as a first step, especially because not everyone can. I mean, there's an awareness of the fact that not everyone can get to an in-person audition, of course. So depending on the program, they might recorded in different ways. The bigger schools have audition locations in a number of big cities and sometimes even internationally. But I would be surprised if there was not any way, if there was no workaround for you to be able to send an audition. The main tips, I would say, are to find something age appropriate if you're looking for an audition monologue. It depends on what kind of actor you think you are, but because this is for an audition entry into the program, not for a specific role in a production, it's better if you can find something that kind of gives a sense of a raw talent. I know that's very vague, but kind of your openness to material that is not, you're not trying to convey that you can play an old lady, but that you are working with the text in an open capacity and you're sort of someone who's going to be able to take notes and be molded in certain ways, because really that's what they're looking for ultimately. to have someone they can work with for 4 years. And usually you have to give 2 monologues anyway. So frequently you have to do a comedic and a dramatic. And so that will give you a little bit of a range. There are tons of resources online. I think Backstage.com in particular has tips for putting together portfolios for auditions. And I'm sure you found on YouTube, and they're not necessarily examples, but there will be lots of examples of these kind of auditions. And yeah, I mean, in terms of, since we have so much at our fingertips now in terms of recording, you just want to make sure it's a high quality recording. You can be heard well, you're enunciating, you have a plain background behind you. Oh gosh. Congratulations, Malgorzata. Okay, to PACE, interesting. I actually have worked with PACE University. Okay, so this is a specific question then about auditioning into their program from already being accepted into the university. Okay, really interesting. Sure. So some possible career paths. As I mentioned here, in terms of interpersonal and communication skills, if you're not looking to go into theater, there are increasingly a number of professional opportunities that are really geared towards finding people who have the interpersonal and communication skills that you gain from having worked in theater, but that can be applied to a number of different industries. So I know that there's particularly particularly as things have changed, let's say, in the culture and climate of bigger businesses, banking and consulting firms and things like that, there's been a real shift in kind of the approach to the workspace and the approach to relating to other people. And there has been an expansion of the field in terms of bringing in outsiders who have the ability to teach other people how to communicate well. And so that's one of the biggest industries that's been growing for people who are coming out of theater and performance, who can offer that skill set to people who don't necessarily automatically have it. This is also, I think, increasing in the sciences. They're having sort of workshop leaders and things like this come in as, you know, the consulting person who can teach communication and improvisation skills, really to build other people's interpersonal relations. So I think particularly there's been a change in the cultural climate in the US, but it's also a side effect of the digital age, right? That we have gotten much more used to interfacing not personally at all. And so definitely in the US, and perhaps it's growing elsewhere, I think it is growing elsewhere, but that there's a reckoning with the fact that a lot of people have sort of lost key skills in terms of communication and interpersonal relations. So there are a lot of names for these different jobs, and the field is actually just growing. But that would be one of these areas. A lot of people also kind of go into other associated fields of criticism. A lot of people also transition into film studies, things like this. There's a lot of roles in film and TV that come from theater, like oh gosh, what is it, the script? I want to say script runner, but it's not that. But there's essentially, you know, people who are dramaturgs, but that work in film and TV. There's a lot of overlap there. There's kind of it's just a big answer in terms of what you can do with theater skills. But I hope that answers it in some way. Okay, great. All right. Well, I guess, are there any more questions?
I would also want to ask, because you gave like a list of possible opportunities in different universities, and I would want to ask if you would recommend any universities, maybe specifically for the musical theater?
To be honest, I just am not in musical theater enough to feel like I can confidently give you a clear answer, I'm afraid. But if any of these programs do have musical theater, I'm sure they would be great. I know they have straight theater, but I'm not 100% sure, just because it is different enough that it hasn't been in my wheelhouse. So I apologize for not having.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Yeah, but again, like I was saying to Małgorzata, that if you put in the very specific key search terms, and a lot of, because it is such a specialty in the US, a lot of programs will really front load that information because there are so many people who are interested and invested in studying musical theater, and they want to pursue that career. And it's really most possible in the US that things like the Onstage blog will highlight that, or Backstage, or even just this, Google search as a very, very basic starting point. You should get a lot of hits. But but unfortunately I don't have any off the top of my head. I'm sorry about that. Searching for internships in theaters. Okay. That also really depends on the context of where you are and what kind of internships you're looking for. But typically, it will be, yes, it really depends on the program. Most theaters are looking for a number of interns in the summer, so it's also something to consider when you're living in the US. What kind of city will you have access to in the summertime? There's really just a range. A lot of people, depending on the size of the theater, there are interns in kind of every possible category, but usually not acting, usually not performance. Usually it's directing, artistic direction, management, literary analysis, those kind of more easily definable categories in which you're working with a higher up within the theater. The way to search those will depend, but all theaters that have solid internships in which they know they're offering them, and usually have offered them multiple years, they have very clear information on their websites. So I guess the most direct way would be if there's once you know where you're going to be, whatever city that will be in, you can familiarize yourself with the theaters in that city. And then depending on the size of those theaters, they are more than likely to offer internships during the summer. The year is a trickier time, and not all, especially not conservatory programs, but not all university programs in general will necessarily encourage you to do internship work during the year, because especially if you're already performing, it takes a lot of out-of-class hours. So that's something to keep in mind. But I would say at least this sort of 200-seat, maybe 300-seat and higher theaters are usually the bigger ones that you're going to be looking for in order to find an internship over the summer. If I am at a university, I can study theater, although I don't. It depends. Yes, this is also a good question. Can you access the theater classes if you're not a major? It depends on the size of the program. Not all programs will allow non-majors to audition into the productions, but some of them do. And it's often the larger programs. In the conservatory, I'm almost positive you couldn't do that. But it really depends. At the university level, yes, exactly. At the university level, there are some programs that offer minors in theater, and then yes, you can definitely audition. That's sort of part of the point of it, is that you're not necessarily a major, but you still have access to the resources of the program, including auditioning. So definitely if you're a major, if you're a minor, but it depends on the university.
Okay, and how about, I'm not sure if I understood Małgorzata's question correctly, because she got accepted to a different program and she wants to study theater. So how difficult would it be to switch majors from something else to theater?
Again, it depends on the university. I think pace because of their relationship with the actor studio, they run it a little bit more like a conservatory program. So it would be a question of whether or not you'd have to reapply altogether. And I'm not 100% sure whether that's the case or not. At a university program, at a BA, in which you're already sort of in a humanities program and you're majoring in theater, but you have to take, you know, general eds and a bunch of other things, it's much simpler to just transfer in, depending on the program. If it's a super competitive program and they're already overtaxed, not necessarily, but the larger the university program, which doesn't mean the program itself, the theater program, is bad at all, it's just a different offering. The larger the program, though, the more likely you can switch into it, to transfer into it. But unfortunately, it just depends. But it's a good question about pace. It's the program of theater, I'm sure Małgorzata knows, it has a pretty serious reputation because of its relationship with the actor studio, and like some celebrities have come out of there and stuff. So it might be trickier in that regard. But I hope this is encouraging and not disconcerting for anybody. There are lots and lots of programs, and opportunities is really sort of the bottom line. And I'm sure that you can find what you're looking for, given the vast range of programs.
Do we have any last questions? Now is the moment to ask the question.
Okay, great. I'm glad. And good luck. PACE is really interesting. So either way, I hope you have a good experience there. And yeah, thank you, Alexandra, for your questions as well. And good luck in musical.
Thank you for answering.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the community. Theater in the US is hard, but great. And we're fiercely loyal. So I hope to see you on the boards.